So my name's Ruth Wallace, I'm the Director of the Apprenticeship. It's a real pleasure to have you here and to be able to introduce Don. Start by acknowledging the traditional owners, the Arrowhead people, of the land on which we meet today, where we work every day. It's a real honour to introduce Don, who has observed the education, particularly vocational education policy in action since the 70s in Darwin, and seen the ups and downs and changes and thinking or logics or illogics all the way through. And through his research had a chance to reflect on that and give us some insights about thinking differently about the future and how we might work in the vocational education space as we progress. And I think that's particularly important with your new role as the chair of the board of the Industry Services Training Advisory Council, the NT. We'll have a very important voice in the future. So without further ado, thank you very much, Don.
Thanks, Ruth. Thanks for coming along. This work is part of an ongoing project that when I started my PhD, I became interested in how the VET system worked rather than the normal questions of who did what, when, to whom, and when that occurred, which has tended to predominate policy areas. So I'm always returning to the question of, well, how did that happen, rather than the why or who or whatever. And so it's a fairly different approach to most of the questions, and as my colleague John Gunther would know, trying to actually find funding to do research in questions that are slightly off that who did what to whom when type approach is fraught with difficulty. In fact, it's political poison for most people. So I have the privilege of being able to play in this space without being too beholden to anyone, but with a careful recognition that I have to be careful I don't offend anyone, so that they don't, or too many people, I guess, to be true, so that they still talk with me. This particular issue is, I was trying to understand how the apprenticeship system works. So this discussion is solely on apprenticeships, but there is a postscript to it at the end that I've added since I did the original presentation because of events overtaking the original work, and we'll get to that in due course. So apprenticeship systems have evolved as part of an answer to the solution to the problems of youth. And this has been a preoccupation with adults, I guess, generally, or society in general, forever in Western-style societies, but I would guess Eastern, although I didn't look at them. And it's certainly, you can trace it back to the Greek city-states had magistrates, an interesting term, given today's headlines around Don Dale, their sole job was, in fact, to look after the Greek city-states' youth at the time. Apprenticeship systems have been known in all human societies. Generally, the apprentice-master relationship is what I'm talking about here, but that's well known. Learning by doing, learning by observing, the teaching of those with intense knowledge to those with less knowledge. That type of arrangement is well established. And national apprenticeship systems continually are being studied and tweaked and manipulated as part of this angst over youth. And so I'm sure that some of you have probably seen just this week the federal government has re-announced its election pledge for hundreds of thousands of jobs, because youth unemployment in some places is 13% with that. And if you look back through the Australian history of VET programs, particularly what was VET in schools, which is now I think VET for school students, or that keeps getting renamed, but the application of adult learning principles that are embodied in VET, of pushing those down into secondary schools, has been an ongoing issue that seldom seems to produce the types of results that are envisaged or promised, but it's over this societal angst of youth that can be traced back. So it's certainly not a new phenomenon. I decided to take a look at the two apprenticeship systems which have a fair amount in common, that is Australia and Great Britain, and the shortcomings that keep appearing in each. So much of the work in the UK is based on the ongoing involvement of Lady Alison Wolfe, who's a peer in the upper house there, and is also, though, an economics professor at the University of London, and has been heavily involved in the apprenticeship area, has at least one complete review in her name. She has written separate to that, but was also then on the Sainsbury Committee, which I'll talk about later. So she's been very heavily involved, but she reflects a broader view, but it's from an economic base, interestingly. It's not necessarily driven by education. In Australia, generally the critiques are reasonably well known. They appear quite frequently, and everyone tends to agree with the shortcomings of the system, and we rename things and tweak things a bit, but the issues don't seem to go. So there's a mismatch between the funded outputs and labor market needs, characteristic of both systems, that's constantly being tweaked to figure out how to do that. And so, for example, the rather infamous example in Victoria producing more personal trainers. I think somebody estimated that every Victorian could have their own personal trainer that had been funded out of the public purse. I think that's a bit of hyperbole, but that type of arrangement that's there. The systems are dominated by major vested interests. So you have employer groups, you have, at some stages in the past there have been union groups, and in some industries, electrical for example, unions are still quite powerful. You have government groups, you have a variety of players that are there. Interestingly enough, those major vested interests don't include students. Students are part of the output. They're things you feed in one end of the sausage machine and get out the other, generally in policy. Some people disagree with me about that, but I'm reasonably clear that the evidence of the way policy's been made and implemented is not on the basis of students, except in fact in vet fee help, where the students were access to money. Then we were very interested in student choice as a rationale. Public payments in both systems go directly to providers. There's a variety of mechanisms for getting there, again, as we've seen with vet fee help, but Charles Darwin University gets a couple of very fat checks, well, actually cash transfers from the Department of Business and the federal government on a semi-annual basis, generally, sometimes quarterly, but essentially public money goes straight to the providers. And what's come to happen is, some people call this a race to the bottom, but the various policy tweakings in both the UK and Australia have resulted in the provision of easy and cheap courses rather than the hard and long and expensive courses, predominantly in the trades. And again, a characteristic of both systems. I need to mention also, though, that there is a difference between the two systems, that in the UK, these qualifications were actually furnished from a market. There are a variety of qualification providers who compete to get training providers to use their qualification. The City and Guilds is one of the more famous ones, but there's actually quite a large, or used to be, quite a large market for the provision of qualifications. And they're not to a national standard. Whereas in Australia, we've had the various iterations of the qualifications framework, where there's been a national standard that's been set for each qualifications. But nevertheless, no matter which way you went to get there, the outcome has been the same of that race to the bottom of cheap and cheerful, a bit like yellowtail wine. The problems continue with, there's been a steadily decreasing apprenticeship starts. And some of you will have been around long enough to remember Minister David Kemp's attempt to actually mask this problem of the decline of youths moving into apprenticeships by using the same name for traineeships and apprenticeships and conflating the issue. And luckily someone at NCDR decided not to follow the minister's wishes and actually unobtrusively kept that data separate. So we've actually still got good data in that space, but there was quite a purposeful policy decision to mask how the traditional trades by introducing, for example, a whole host of retail certificate 1 and 2 traineeships and calling them the same thing. That's happened in the UK as well. They've masked that name, what apprenticeship means, quite well. There's been a general increase in the age of apprentices, so the received wisdom of finish school at 15 or 16 and then move into apprenticeship is not the norm now in either country. These are other people's views, but misconceived vocational education policies. I think most everyone can point to their favorite inappropriate policy in VET, or a suite of them usually. But the VET is being used for other purposes generally. That so we will tack training in onto almost any social problem, and that will help make it saleable in a variety of ways. And giving rise to scandals and revelations, shopper, of poor training outcomes. And so again, that works in both countries. What I wanted to do, though, is look why each of the two countries responded differently to the same set of problems. And so I used what's called a Foucauldian discourse analysis. Michel Foucault, French philosopher, writer, theoretician, amongst other things, studied words, looked at what words were being used and what works they were being done. What were the discourses, the discussions in this sector that allowed these things to occur. And I also then, so that was methodology, but the more the theory was around Thielen's adaptation of path dependency. Thielen did a study of 4 nations' apprenticeship systems, the UK, Germany, the US, and Japan, and looked at why they were very, very different and were in fact quite resistant to change. So, for example, the UK has a system that's very much like ours. We would recognize that: work-based apprenticeships, master-apprentice relationship, long periods of time in a college setting, off-the-job training, if you will. The Japan is very much inside the big corporations, lifetime job, come in, have a variety of pathways through, but you're tied pretty much to that workplace, and a heavy emphasis on what at one stage was known as total quality management, management issues, just-in-time ordering, a whole host of things, but very much part of a large corporation and not all that much government money into it. The US is quite different again, and essentially they don't have a national training system. And the unions, in fact, are very heavily involved in deciding, particularly in the traditional trades, in the traditional apprentices, about who gets what skills and who has access to that. And Germany, for those in the area, is quite well known with its dual track system and a tripartite system of unions, employers, and government deciding about midway through high school about which track one's going to pursue. And I wish I had 10% return on every Australian trip to Germany that's been paid for to have a look at that system and then to come back and try and implement elements of it in Australia. Although, to be fair, much of our system now goes back to Australia Reconstructed, which was about 1987 trip, I think, by the trade unions, sponsored by a minister portrayed by the name of Dawkins, John Dawkins, who sent a group over, and they brought back many of the elements of what we see in the national training system today, mostly from Sweden. They were mostly impressed with. But it was that tripartite approach and careful tracking and retraining that's there. So Thielen proposed that, in fact, you end up on path dependency, which means that what you do in the future is dependent on what path you've traveled to get to now. Okay, it narrows options. You don't have actually an open panorama in front of you. In fact, there's only a few tracks, and they're dependent on where you've been. And she noted that in the training systems that she studied, that in fact there were two things happening in this area of path dependency. One was conversion. So the training system was being converted to new ends. It had an original purpose, which was actually producing skilled workers, but it's converted to new ends. And so vet schools, for example, would be one of those things. Or there was institutional layering, and that is a grafting of new elements onto an existing stable institutional framework. So you can see that quite clearly, that certainly in the 50s and 60s, vocational training in Australia was male, explicitly male only. Hairdressing was excluded, even though it was trained that way. It was manufacturing almost exclusively. There were a variety of elements of it that were very much a male-dominated manufacturing workforce, essentially. But in fact, that has been spread to everything. I don't know, how many qualifications are there now? 8,000 or thousands of qualifications in almost any area one wishes to name that can get an industry group up who's willing to put in the work to get a qualification approved. Same thing happened in the UK, by the way. They had something like over 15,000 qualifications. I say had, and you'll see why. So conversion and institutional layering. One is changing the purpose. The other is adding new jobs on top of it. New tasks, I guess. So both Britain and Australia are path dependent. And it depends upon their different types of social welfare and full employment linkages that give rise to the distinct apprenticeship system. So full employment is also a policy outcome of governments. And the main path to full employment is through training. It's just an ongoing link. It's all but impossible to break, partly because of path dependency. In the UK, the apprenticeships, this is about the apprenticeship system, and it was originally voluntary. You would voluntarily enter into an apprenticeship arrangement on all parties. That's the employer, the unions, the individual. And so you could work in an industry, but you didn't actually have to undertake an apprenticeship to be in there. And there would be different pay levels in that, but it was a voluntary arrangement, particularly for employers. Okay, there wasn't any government intervention in the apprenticeship. What erupted, though, were battles between the unions and employers. And one of the ways the government chose to resolve that was to set up in the 60s and 70s, post-World War II, the industry training boards and industry levies. Because government wasn't involved with regulating or financing the apprenticeship system, the view was that employers would pay for it. And to get some national consistency, they would levy, they'd raise money, and set up the industry training boards. Primarily, there were about 27 of them, and of which only 2 have survived, and they're both in the construction industry. that may sound familiar to those of you technically that understand the way Australia works. There's one construction body that has a levy associated with that has survived here in Australia, but a direct import from the UK. By the 1970s, the entire system had collapsed. They were down to less than about, I think it's 30,000 apprentices in the entire nation. It just didn't work. And so government felt that it needed to take over, so started funding. Progressively, the levies disappeared, which aided and abetted the collapse, because essentially what happened is people said, the employers said, well, we can save money if we don't train. Okay, and regardless if they were paying the levy or not, it was easier for them to go pinch other people who did the training. They were paying the same regardless. And the system was taken over by the government, expanded, and last year the Cameron government announced the reimposition of an industry training levy. And when announced, it didn't have the details, but they've since come out. And so every business that has a payroll of more than £3 million a year will pay a certain percentage of that into a fund which is managed by an industry-led group. And they will fund RTOs with a voucher system. Okay? There will be some government money that will go into certain priority groups, which have been reasonably narrowly defined, but youth being the main one. In Australia, there is a very different way of dealing with social justice and economic issues and the full employment issue. And it was through strong unions and conciliation and arbitration courts who would decide the wages. They would decide apprentice wages at that time. But the social goal was full employment, and the conciliation and arbitration courts were very powerful in those days. They determined, they saw themselves as a tool to determine what society would look like. And so I think it was called the Harvester case of about 1912 or something like that. Actually talked about a fair day's wage for a fair day's labor, and the basis was it'd be a man with a wife at home and 2 children. That was the gold brick standard of you needed enough money, no matter what your job is, to meet their needs. So a very different system from the laissez-faire UK system where government stayed out of that, and welfare was pretty much left to churches or philanthropy or the poorhouses. So a very different background. There were state-based apprenticeship authorities, unlike the UK. There were state-based technical colleges, again, unlike the UK, which tended to have national control over these areas. We added traineeships to increase the numbers, particularly through the 80s and 90s. And at one stage, in the about 2006, 7, 8, or thereabouts, there were considerably more trainees than there were apprentices. The numbers swapped over quite a bit. There was a failed attempt in the early 90s and mid-90s to introduce a training levy in Australia, but hugely unpopular, and there's a plethora of stories around about senior management taking training courses in Bali and Fiji and that to meet their requirement. Although, to be fair, what the evaluation of the training levy actually showed is in industries that believed in training, it worked. They increased their training. The skilled workers on the floor actually got the training they needed. But in industries that did not have a history of training, it didn't work at all. The system was abused. And it was unpopular regardless. The general view was it's better if government, if you're a business person or a corporation, it's better if government pays for the training than we do. You know, it's fairly simple economics. And in Australia, there's been an expansion of student loans from the original HECS in higher ed into the vocational space. And so while vet fee help has grabbed a lot of the headlines, there's actually a number of incentives that were there for apprentices who have now been wrapped up into a loan for apprentices. I think they can get up to $20,000. And someone speculated that there would be an awful lot of utes and mobile phones purchased with that. Is that true, Catherine?
That's true.
Oh, okay. Both countries, so those are the differences. Both countries actually, though, practice new public management, which had a funder, and the funder could be from a variety of places, but it could be from industry if you had a levy. It could be a government minister, or if you had a student loan or fees, fee for help, it could be the client. You have a purchaser, which could be a government agency. In the UK, with their voucher system that industry will spend, it's industry, or it could be the individual who will make a choice, but that's relatively rare. The provider, there's public providers, there's private providers, for-profit providers, not-for-profit providers that are private in community education. Interestingly enough, the Northern Territory government, back during the Labor era, about 2008 or 9, decided to stop funding community education providers here in the Northern Territory. We're one of the few jurisdictions that has no public funding going into that, and one wouldn't necessarily always associate that with a labor ethos, but just mildly interesting. The client can be the government using public dollars. It could be industry, or it could be the individual, depending on what funding system's in place. And so path dependency determines who sits where, depending on the policy, the program, and the decision. So the argument is that path dependency has determined a different set of roles in the UK for each of those, of funder, purchaser, provider, client, and come up with a different outcome in Australia. Okay, so conversion, so remember Thielen said there was, conversion was one of the ways in which path dependency played itself out. It's actually brought the two systems closer together. So converting the system to a different thing than originally intended. So we've introduced training markets and provider choice. We've introduced hundreds of new qualifications, probably thousands actually, I was being a bit, certainly new apprenticeships. There's hundreds of new apprenticeships, thousands of qualifications. A continual tinkering with who pays. Is it state government, is it federal government, is it the individual, is it industry? And so you have co-funding arrangements, for example, on some of the big national projects. Some of you might remember the Productivity Places program, which had a co-funding element to it. And I forget what it's called. Is it the Industry Development Fund or something like that now?
Skills Development Fund.
Skills Development Fund has here in Australia has that. And that's happened in the UK. That same set of fiddling about with. So in the UK, for example, the older you get, the more you pay as an individual for your training. Kids pay nothing. Adults over 25 pay a lot, sort of thing. And of course, each of these times that someone tinkers with the process, it produces unintended outcomes. They just didn't know what was going to happen, and used the streaker's defense. It seemed like a good idea at the time, Your Honor. Institutional layering, okay, the second of Thielen's purposes of grafting on new activities, has, I would argue, led to the two differences in the systems. So while dependency, conversion, path dependency made them more the same, it's understanding institutional layering, this grafting on, that explains the differences in the system. Okay, so Britain retains its link to age as a production unit. Always in the UK, because there was no government funding and the apprenticeship system was voluntary, that was an employment cost for the employer immediately, from day one, the employer was paying a marginally or little skilled person to produce things. And the benefit gained by giving them more skills, training them up, and they would be more productive. So the whole view of the apprentice was that as a production unit. In Australia, and this goes back to particularly a very explicit review, the Wright Review in the 1950s, early 1950s. It took 3 years to do the review, interestingly enough. But they did not believe in age. It was skills-based at that time. And they saw the students as education units, and they saw that there should be a cost to the student because they were getting something out of it. The education was producing something from them. Now, the cost was quite marginal in those days, but nevertheless, there's a very distinct difference of the conceptualization of that young person, of the apprentice, or what was a young person. One was a production unit in the UK, education unit in Australia. And there were different means of shifting the cost then, depending on how you viewed the student. So in Australia, it was quite easy to shift the cost to government because they were education units and they weren't taking up a space in a secondary school. Not that many of them were destined to go there necessarily, but it was felt that it was only fair that if we're going to pay for senior students in high school, we should pay for apprentices. We should furnish technical colleges and so forth. So the funding mechanisms that have evolved in each place, I would argue, have come about from this institutional layering. There's been more jobs, more tasks put on, particularly the Australian system, where you can make a case for, there's a public good case for education as a general benefit. Much harder to make the case in the UK. Okay, there's a view about that they will turn into production units. And so neoliberalism gets blamed for a lot of things that have happened in both countries. There will be, this marketization of that is a neoliberal scheme. Well, I don't think that actually explains how this system has worked. How we've got the two systems that are different now has come about because of where they've been. So in Australia, it would be political death to try and introduce an employer levy again. It just ain't going to happen. Whereas in the UK, because they had a history of it, and it worked in their system, employer levy was a logical place to go that was generally accepted. In fact, it was the conservative side of politics, which is generally seen to be pro-business, that introduced it. So there's this path dependency, and you can map through a lot of things, and I won't push that too hard right now, but I'm happy to answer any questions about it. I've just got a handout because the actual bit that comes up on the screen isn't too flash. Okay, so the UK, I want to give you a map of where the apprenticeship system sits in the UK. So the UK government commissioned, and this is the Cameron government, commissioned Sainsbury review. It was 5 people, including Alison Wolfe, to look at the post-16 education structure in the UK. And the UK government, subject to funding, as always, has announced that they have accepted the report in its entirety. What they will have is 15 routes across all of technical education. They're getting rid of the word vocational. They believe that vocations can be obtained in many ways. This is about technical education, and these are about large occupational skill sets. And they believe, obviously there'll be some fur around the edges, but they believe that 15 of them can be identified or have been identified, which would meet students' needs. So a student, I'll come back to the exact details on it. So essentially there will be 2 pathways. One will be, 3 pathways. One will be academic. About 60% of the kids will go through that. 16-year-olds, that is. So I say kids, young adults, depending on your view. kids, particularly if you've got one at home. There will be apprenticeships, which is the section that I've just been talking about, and that must include at least 12 months on the job learning in the journey through to get to qualification. That's how you define it. And there will be a 2 years college-based qualification, but they'll all be now to national standards. The handful of national standards, the 15 routes, the 15 qualifications, will replace the failed market and provisional qualifications. It was really unusual to see now a declaration of market failure in VET, of the push towards increased marketization. So here's one of the first examples of pulling back from the market being the answer to the problems of VET. Interestingly enough, absolutely unrelated, but I've just seen a report where in fact the United States government has announced it's going to stop renewing contracts with private prisons. The privatization of prisons in the U.S. has now been declared a failure by the government. So this hope for benefits of marketization and the inability to talk about it, the cracks are starting to appear in that facade, which is interesting. Low-skilled technical knowledge qualifications will be outside the new system. So essentially, I think what this is meaning, if we want to translate that into Australian terms, a lot of Certificate 1 and 2 stuff is not going to be inside the new national qualification. That's a generic work type thing, and by all means, they're probably important to do, but they're not part of a national technical qualification. There will be, if one chooses the college route to go, it must have high quality work placements, and they will be supported by government funding to ensure it. So the colleges will be staffed and provisioned to ensure that every student who's following the college pathway to the same qualification an apprentice gets at the end has work placement in there. So there's an on-the-job component, which has been a crucial issue, I think, for a number of qualifications here in Australia over time, and particularly apprenticeships. And again, another case of backing off of marketization. There will be no public funds allocated to for-profit training providers. The view is, the type of statement they're using is that public money should only go to training providers who are willing to reinvest it into the training system and not take the money out of the system. Again, an interesting sort of decision on the part of a conservative government. Now, I've put this up here, and that's what I've given you. I wasn't sure how much this would come out. So essentially, you can see the academic option goes to, and there's crossover points. So they've thought through the ability that once you turn 16, and say you choose the technical option, you still have a pathway back to higher education, and vice versa. If you choose the academic and decide that you want to be in a technical occupation, you can do that. And you can see the difference then between the college-based and the employment-based. And the UK also has a handful of technical universities. So you move into your higher level qualifications at that. And they also, the Sainsbury report is noting and advocating for a number of specialist evolving skills needs areas. So for example, there's a national center to train people to operate on the new high-speed rail system that's going to link much of the country. There's some stuff in technology. I think there's 5 or 6 major national ones now, but they will expand depending on government policy around, what's the word? Oh, innovation, that's it. Again, some things still in common. It's an interesting change. I mean, I wonder, I mean, for the discussion around institutional apprenticeships has been around here in Australia for a long time. Particularly, it was very common in Western Australia. There were a number of people who were there pushing for it at one stage. But I think it's dropped off, and it's probably, I think, given that the NT government, its last legislative function was to essentially change the Vocational Training Act here in the Territory to more or less replicate the conditions, and certainly not to take a bold step like this of offering an alternative pathway through apprenticeships. So the part I was talking about in my presentation today is this far right-hand side. Okay, so that's the space where there will be employer levies, there will be an apprentice, master-apprentice relationship. Essentially, if you're young and you're 16 and you go through, it's fully paid for. If you jump into the apprenticeship space, from memory, there's two age groups that determine how much public subsidy you get. And if you're over 25, so 16 to 20, 20 to 25, it's half subsidy. Over 25, you've got to pay the lot yourself. And I don't think there's a loan scheme yet that's there. I think I'll stop there. I've gone on just a bit, but happy to have a chat.